This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. My guest this week argues that the American unipolar moment is indeed over, but the era of American global hegemony is not. This is my interview with Daniel Bessner. I am joined from Seattle, Washington by Daniel Bessner, who was actually on Unregistered, my goodness, like 6 years ago, I think, 2019, I believe it was.
A long time ago.
Earlier. This is when people actually talk to each other face to face. I actually came to your house in Seattle and sat with you, and we'd shared spittle. I mean, it was quite, I missed those days. And that was, I think, before you had your new position, which is very fancy. In fact, I think you weren't even tenured then.
I was either in the process of or becoming. I think I honestly don't remember when I got tenure.
You were on the cusp. You were precarious.
It was close to I felt tenured.
Oh, okay. I thought you were a little bit precarious then, but anyway, you are certainly not that now. So you are, and I never say this because I hate this shit, but it's important for a few reasons. This guy, Daniel Bessner right here, is the Annette H. and Kenneth B. Pyle Professor in American Foreign Policy at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Now, I say that not to suggest that makes you smarter than the rest of us or better than any of us, Mr. Bessner, Professor Bessner, but
that's for the audience to decide.
Exactly. They'll find out soon. But to let people know, what I'm announcing is that there actually still are some professors who do this kind of work who are very worth listening to. I have a very, 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 very low opinion of academia, and even had a low opinion of it when I was a part of it. But yeah, you're one of the few remaining good ones. So you're also rising. I've noticed you're getting a lot more attention. You were on Bill Maher. You were on the Glenn Lowry show, which is great. And I love to see that. So I've been excited to follow you as a new media personality and to see your various different projects. You're working on a project. Can we talk about the podcast that we were just on?
Yeah, we could talk about whatever, of course.
I mean, You're working on a huge podcast series on Kurt Cobain and the rise of grunge music. So you're interested in pop music?
Yeah, I'm interested in pop stuff, and I've done for the Nirvana podcast. I forget the exact number, but it's dozens of interviews in the 80s or maybe even in the 90s, I believe. And it's a political economy of grunge podcast, sort of examining how the political economy of the Pacific Northwest and particularly the Seattle region, including the Olympic Peninsula, shaped the rise of grunge. Right now, that podcast though is stalled because, as we were talking off mic, the scripted podcast market is not what it was several years ago. It turns out it's very difficult to make money in podcasting when you're spending a lot of money, and that it's actually indie podcasts. Again, I haven't looked super deeply into this, but I've looked somewhat deeply into this. Indie podcasts are actually the best in terms of a sustainable business model for the podcasting industry. So right. I'm sure I will eventually do something with that podcast today at some point, not today, in the future, because I've done way too much work and it's a subject that I'm interested in. But yeah, right now that project is paused. But beyond that, I'm actually Thad. When is this going to come out? Do you know?
Few days.
Okay, so I have a forthcoming piece in Harper's Magazine on the WGA strike and the contemporary state of the entertainment industry. So that's a nice long piece, big report. I've done, I forget how many, several dozen interviews for that in the 30s, I believe.
Wow.
interviewing a bunch of different people. So check out that when it comes out in Harper's
Okay,
if you're
but
interested in
you
Hollywood.
right. And this is, I love that you're doing this. You're damn near the only professor who is a generalist in that way. But your primary academic field is geopolitics, U.S. foreign policy, international relations,
Well,
and
I would say
history.
it's related because
Yes.
my field was intellectual history. I did
Yes.
intellectual history of U.S. foreign policy, and so it's actually not as much as of a leap. The Nirvana Project is a bit of a leap, but it's just basically applying a political economic lens onto art. But the stuff about the WGA and the entertainment industry is it's really related to intellectuals in writing.
Yeah.
So it's I've long thought about the social role of the intellectual, the role of the writer. So it's actually kind of it's adjacent, I would say, part of my like broader intellectual world because I do intellectual history of US foreign policy. Now I'm just doing intellectual history of a different field. Also, my first book was of course on psychological warfare, which is not disconnected from Hollywood and communications and stuff like that. So it's not as big of a leap as it might appear just in
Hmm.
the way I describe it.
Well, I'm thinking not so much of intellectual history, but of American popular culture, lowbrow or middlebrow American popular culture. Have you been interested in its effects abroad in other countries, its popularity in other countries, and that relation to geopolitics?
Not really.
Yeah,
And so
right.
that
I
is
figured. I
like
figured.
a big subject of I just don't think it's that fundamentally important.
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
where people listen to rock and roll or wear blue jeans. That was a
Yes.
big topic of conversation
Yes.
amongst boomer historians.
Right here.
Oh right, you focus on it.
I'm an
Okay,
old
there you
Gen
go.
X.
Yeah.
But yes.
I just
No,
don't. I just never thought it was from my perspective. Not. I mean, that work is interesting. It's just not never grabbed my interest, and I never thought it was that causally important.
yeah.
So I didn't focus on it.
I'm gonna make the argument, not here, but in my forthcoming book, I will change your mind. But
There
no,
you go.
I will bring it up a bit here. But yeah, no, I think it's actually the path to world peace, and I'm not kidding. I think it's
Well,
the
there you
end.
go.
It's ultimately, it will resolve the contradictions of the American empire. But
Well, there you go.
yeah, I wrote a piece like 1,000 years ago in Ceylon when Ceylon was actually reasonable about this. But if you want to check that out, but yeah, so no, you just, and this is important and really interesting. You dismiss it as unimportant culture, pop culture, and I've heard you say this elsewhere. This wasn't surprising. I knew it was coming because you identify as a Marxist, at least in your sort of primary analytical mode, which I dig and I think is important and fascinating. But just so people are clear, like I knew you were going to say that about culture because that's what smart Marxists are supposed to say. That's what they do say. Because, and this is what we're going to get to. For Marxists of your type, history proceeds by and according to material conditions or changes in material conditions, things like economics, and in particular the structure of an economy, not according to ideas. Ideas don't make history. That's what Hegel said. Marx said, no, it's the other way around. It's the actual material conditions that make history. And so with,
Well, I mean, just to be, I mean, I think
yeah.
they interact in actual history.
Oh, I see. You're not a
Yeah,
vulgar
yeah.
Marxist. Okay, good.
No, of course not. I
That's
think it's
good.
difficult to be a vulgar Marxist in 2024.
Yeah, no,
But yeah, of
right.
course, the base and superstructure interact in mutually reinforcing and contradictory and tension-filled ways in actual history. Yeah.
Yeah.
When you're analyzing like a discrete moment, I mean, intellectual historian, right? Like the people that I studied had particular ideas and they instantiated them in actual history. They were, of course, directed in particular directions, and other possibilities were closed off by the political economy. But in trying to explain historical events, I think you have to examine both. I just don't think pop culture, as traditionally understood, is that important in geopolitics.
Right, right, right. Um, yeah, well, again, maybe we'll get back to that. But so, all right. So now you make some other, I think, extremely important and I think totally correct arguments about the relationship between democracy and at least US foreign policy, which is that there is none. Right?
Yeah,
I
very little. Yeah.
Professor Bessner, I since literally was an infant because I was born into a Trotskyist family, have been marching against every single US military intervention in the world. I've marched against every military intervention in the world since Vietnam. And what you say is that was all like a waste of time.
Well, I mean, that's
Because they don't care. Because the foreign policy establishment, the people who
if
make,
you're talking about affecting foreign policy, then it
yeah,
doesn't have much of an effect. I mean, I think the late 60s, it did destabilize things to the degree where small c conservatives were concerned about the effects of the war in American society. And I do think there was a causal link between the anti-draft movement and the switching of the strategy with
true,
regards to North Vietnam and the NLF towards focusing more on bombing and less on troop deployment. So it does
true.
have an effect. But if you're
That's true.
talking about the general structure of U.S. foreign policy after the draft in particular, I think the draft is the important moment there.
Oh,
So when Congress doesn't renew the draft in the early 1970s, it just becomes much less important. Protest movements become much less important to shaping the direction of U.S. foreign policy because ultimately the bourgeoisie doesn't have much skin in the game.
yep. Wow. Okay, let's get back to that. But yeah, so I want to illustrate this point for people who don't believe me, because there's still a pretty common conception that the anti-war movement is what ended the Vietnam War. So Norman Morrison self-immolated, yeah, in 1965, right in front of Robert McNamara's office at the Pentagon. McNamara actually even saw it, but it's a 65. What did McNamara then do for the next 3 years? He escalated radically in Vietnam. And then, of course, by 68, we had million people in the streets everywhere, and Lyndon Johnson was surrounded wherever he went, sort of like Biden, except even worse, I think. And guess what happened? The war continued, and then the bombing happened, and then troops didn't leave until 1973. So come on, people, the anti-war movement had nothing to do with this, right? Ending the war.
Well, so the question, I think the newest historical scholarship, I think focuses on basically the role of the right wing in ending the war. And it does seem like the right was concerned about social instability, basically.
Wait, tell me
So I
this.
think, yeah. So I mean, I'm not an expert on this. Sean Fear, we talk about it on my podcast in the
Wow.
Vietnam episode with Sean Fear, but that's basically the claim. It's that it's like one of the concatenation of factors that encouraged the right to turn on the war in the early to mid 1970s. The concern about social instability.
Oh,
So it has an orthogonal effect on how like more important people understood things, and it does have an effect, again, think on the tactics of the war. But I think the ending of the draft is again the really crucial thing there.
yeah, I agree with that very much. All right. So that's interesting about the right. I'd never even thought of that or heard of that, there's an anti-war right beyond like
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Particularly as the war drags on. Again, Sean Fear, a historian of Vietnam, great historian of Vietnam, spoke to me about this. This is like the newest research. This is not my field, so I'm not an
fascinating.
expert on it.
Gotcha,
Yeah.
gotcha. All right, let's get back to your field. So, which in some ways is modern liberalism, right? I mean, you've written about this. You've
Yeah,
talked
more
about it a lot.
recently too. Yeah.
In some ways, I mean, I think your first book is that as well. It's about modern liberalism, what we call liberalism, and in particular in terms of geopolitics. So yeah, so you have one big thesis, which again I think is right to an extent. I guess I probably disagree with the politics of it, but I think the basic analysis is correct and really fundamental, which is that this world order we're in basically was established in the late 19th century, turn of the 20th century, or I guess you actually say World War I, right? Is when it sort of begins, or the old order ends, which is when, according to you, am I right, that the working class, broadly speaking, in Europe,
Yeah.
and I suppose America, embraces nationalism and starts killing and dying for nationalism and then for you, it's instead of for a class politics, a revolutionary politics, a redistributive politics, that kind of thing. That's where I'm not totally sure. I don't know if that was actually the only alternative, but anyway, it doesn't really matter since it didn't win. What did win was nationalism.
Yeah,
And
no, that's broadly. Yeah, that's
okay,
certainly what I broadly think. Yeah, I'm just curious. What type of alternative would you imagine there,
well, I mean, so
given the state of politics at the time?
we're both historians, and so I'm trying to be a good historian here and remember this, because it's, you got to historicize this, and the first thing I think is, oh, but the European working class, unlike America, was actually full of communists and socialists, at the turn of the 20th century. So that was a real thing, a real viable.
Well, there wasn't really that split yet, and the World War I engenders that split. This is the famous. Is it Chorsky? This is the famous, you know, Oh God, I'll look it up. But there's a famous historian who wrote his book, like The Great Schism is the name of the book, and it talks about between
Ern,
1905 and
is it Cassirer?
1907.
Is that Ernst Cassirer?
No, it's
Oh,
I think it's Shorsky, but let me okay, anyway, I'll look it up. But anyway, so I
okay.
think the war is really crucial there. Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure. So all of a sudden, World War I, we see all these working class men shooting each other in the blood
Yes.
lens of
It's
Europe,
called
right?
German Social Democracy, 1905 to 1917, The Development of the Great Schism by Karl E. Shorsky. And that
Okay.
goes into this really well. Sorry to interrupt.
Okay. And it's about, broadly speaking, like, is that right? The sort of choice that you could say the working class makes then? Is that a way to
Yeah,
speak
well, this
about
is the
this?
fight. Like, I mean, I think the most prominent and important movement is in Germany, and there's a split between the Social Democrats who vote for war credits and the Social Democrats who don't vote for war credits.
Right.
And then they become something else. They become the Spartacus League, and they become
Right.
more revolutionary. And then after 1917, with the Bolshevik Revolution, they associate with the Bolsheviks, but they're not defined by them. Over the course of the 20s, the communists become more defined by the KPD, in Germany becomes more defined by its relationship with the Soviet Union. So it's a World War I thing.
So this is why you're a very pessimistic man, right? Like, this is why you're
It's
very
just realism, dude. I mean,
dark
like,
and
hard to look at the
moody.
world.
It's not just living in Seattle. It's this, right? It's the fucking working class chose to be nationalists 100 years ago, and they've never gotten over it. And I mean this. Is this not the problem? I think it is the problem.
I mean, I think that I would not use the language of choice. I don't think that's
Right.
necessarily accurate,
Right.
but yeah, something I think happened in World War One that change the potential development of large political transformation, particularly because at that point the literal states, the mechanism of rule weren't that developed. So they were something that could be taken over. I would say by today, the capitalists aren't in control anymore either. The system, as Marx predicted,
Whoa.
is now running things. The way that I put it on other podcasts is that Skynet has become self-aware. I think this is one of the reasons that billionaires like Bill Ackman and Elon
Oh,
Musk are so deranged or want to go to space, because they don't actually have like the influence of in the way someone like JP Morgan did, or
yeah.
Andrew Mellon did. And so I think that's also important, in that when the decision to fight World War I was made, it was at a historical moment when the state was immature enough to actually be taken over and redirected. I don't think that's possible in 2024.
Right. Okay. But I mean, it's also just that, well, wait, what, so if it wasn't a choice by the peoples or the working class of Europe to choose nationalism, to choose to fight people in countries next door to theirs, what was it then? Were they
Well, I mean,
forced
it's
into
it's
it?
it's not a choice if you're getting drafted into the military under forced coercion. I mean, right? It's not
Well,
simple as like we have this choice to either do this or do that. For whatever reason, for a lot of reasons, the organized working classes in the unions, in the various other organizations, did not come together in such a way as to reject the nationalist and imperialist World War I in favor of transnational class solidarity.
wow.
Was that a choice, or was that partially a choice and partially structurally
Okay.
channeled? You'd have to really get into that. But the idea of like active choice is just, I think, inaccurate. Does not
But
reflect what was happening.
but
It
are
wasn't
you
like a series of like a billion individual choices being made to fight World War One.
okay? Let me try this again. So this is a just one of the biggest facts that no one ever talks about to me. Like, as far as I know, basically every single army that fought in both World War I and World War II was a conscript army. All of them, Allies, Axis, doesn't matter which side you're on. I think every one of them had a major component that was conscripts. Is that right? By the way, does that sound right?
That's yeah, yeah, yeah.
I mean, the
Like
vast
the
majority,
drafts. Yeah,
the
yeah.
vast majority of the men who fought in both world wars were drafted, were slaves, were conscripted. So, what was their agency? What was their choice? What was their ideological commitment to any of this stuff, right? But aren't you saying that there was an ideological commitment at a certain point in the 20th century by the broad masses to choose nationalism, their nation over others against?
Well, I guess this is like sort of the old sociological point that was made actually a lot in the 20s and the 30s. Like every ruler, even if a dictator, ultimately serves at the pleasure of the masses. Right. Like so
Mm,
this was a big conversation after World
mhm.
War II in particular. Like, to what degree is the German populace guilty of the crimes of the Nazi Party.
Right.
And so, I mean, that's a complicated question with not an easy
Yeah.
soundbite answer.
Right.
But that's the question, right? Like this goes into like mass. To what degree are masses agents if they allow someone like a Hitler to rule, right?
Right. Right.
Yeah, a big question. No, again, no easy answer. That has a
Yeah.
lot of philosophical dimensions, moral dimensions, empirical dimensions.
Yeah. I just kind of a sort of side personal note about this issue. I am enraged whenever I hear, which is all the time, Americans casually conflate German with Nazi when talking about World War II. They assume that every soldier in the Wehrmacht in the World War II movie is a Nazi. And I'm like, actually, 90% of them were not even members of the party.
I
Uh,
don't know the statistics, but
I
it would
do.
I would also like my understanding is certain units were more Nazified. The Waffen SS was
Oh,
more
for sure.
Nazified, and
For sure. Yeah.
like the average conscript. I don't. I also like the Nazis. Like at some points in the 30s, if I recall correctly, they close off joining the party, right? So necessarily like party membership isn't necessarily the only
Mm,
thing that you'd be able to look at because there's
mm,
limits on that actually, and it takes.
hmm.
Yeah, but my understanding it's a complicated
Yeah.
question the degree to which like the ordinary German was ideologically committed
Well,
to the
well,
Nazi
this
project.
I know 90% of the Wehrmacht was conscripts, so they couldn't be that ideologically committed. But let's get back to the king, which is the United States of America. So, and its working class, and I still talk in this way, even though I'm no longer really a Marxist, but like I do think that's a decent category and concept. I think there was such a thing, certainly then. Self-identified working class, by the way, that did choose overwhelmingly from the very get-go nationalism of the American variety, which is this globalist nationalism, but it's still an American thing, choosing to fight and die in wars rather than either join with their working class brothers in a international socialist revolution or doing something else. Um, that's what they chose, and they chose it early on and overwhelmingly. And
Yeah, I mean, like the labor union leadership
yeah,
aligns with the Cold War very early, for
100%.
again a variety of reasons. And America has always had more, again, small c conservative unions than other areas of the North Atlantic,
Right.
going back a long time. I mean, and that's because we have more land. So you were able to release the valve of class conflict by giving, white working men land for a long time throughout much of the country's history.
Oh, right. So there's your materialist analysis of why that emerged here.
I
Let me
mean, yeah,
challenge
the
you.
land, man. Like if you're the
Oh,
third son in Albany, you come to Seattle. You're able
okay.
to like have
Oh,
land.
oh, here we go. Okay. So okay, I think we're broadly in agreement though on what we're calling the working class, the non-elites of these countries, of Europe and America during this time, the last 120 years or so, right? I think we're broadly in agreement on that. Now, it just now occurred to me where I think we have a difference, and I really am curious about what we say about this. Okay, so that's the masses, that's the people who are being manipulated and led into wars and whatever. Then there's the people actually running foreign policy, and let's talk about this country, right? So the foreign policy establishment in this country, and having written about it, the history of it, and read all these people, it comes down to what, like a couple hundred people have made all the major
I think it's more than that, but yeah, small group of people for sure.
maybe
A
a
few
thousand
thousands. Yeah, yeah.
who have made all the major decisions about foreign policy in this country, going back to
Yeah.
Washington. So
Yeah, it changes over time. Like now there's probably more people in that like group of experts than there were. I mean, I know there are more people than
think
there were in
tanks.
1920 and 30, 40, 50. It's grown over the last 100 years.
Yeah,
But yeah, and the
true.
United States' foreign policy, of course, in the first century has mostly to do with expansion and indigenous dispossession. And so that's also like, it's not like that's not purely State Department. That's Department of the Interior and stuff like that. So it's difficult to
Okay.
make like broad statements. The foreign policy establishment to me is really an artifact of the post World War I period.
Oh, okay. So now I'm amazed I don't know this about you. Maybe I asked you about this before, but like, so for me, the driver of the whole thing from the jump, I mean, from before the American Revolution, among the American foreign policy establishment, was this form of Christian, millenarian, evangelical
Yeah,
stuff.
it's really important. Yeah, yeah. The
Okay,
city
good.
upon a hill
Okay.
stuff. Yeah, yeah,
Good,
yeah.
good. I mean, so like we are not, it's not only our right, it is our obligation given to us by God to go out and save other peoples and uplift them and make them like us, right?
Yeah, I think it's both. It's the right and obligation. They're
Yeah,
combined.
yeah, yeah. Oh yeah. Well, whatever. If you have the obligation, you don't need it, you don't care about the right. So okay, cool. Now I see that as guiding every major decision in American foreign policy from, as I said, before the American Revolution. Okay, at least until a few years ago. Now, I don't know if this is, and I'm really curious about what you have to say about this. So is that, first of all, you do see that as being somewhat of a determinant
Oh,
of what,
absolutely.
okay,
Yeah.
cool.
I mean, I think like it's ironic when Kennan, is writing about the Soviet Union, like they have this total vision, and there's an element of truth there, but like so does the Protestant millenarianism that he comes out of, very much so. And I think in actual history, that millenarianism has proven very influential in at least defining the U.S. strategic approach to the world and its globality, its truly global position. In terms of whether it affected every U.S. foreign policy decision, I think you have to look at these decisions. It is more influential at certain moments and less influential at other moments. I don't think it's like that's not the only spine of this story.
Um, no, but I think that even things that look like sort of crass economic grabs, like the war for oil. I mean, to me, it's always been in service of a greater mission, right? It's you get the
Well, I mean,
oil.
that comes into question about like creating causal hierarchies, and you can't make a
Ah,
general statement about those. You'd have to look at the actual situation and then use your analytical skills to say, like, when John Foster Dulles does this, what is truly driving him? Is it his, source? Is it his history in Protestant missionary culture, or is it he wants
right.
oil? Right. And so you'd have
Yeah.
to actually look at that situation instead of just, saying it's the Protestant part. Maybe it is, but you'd have to look at it.
Well, I mean, okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm thinking of like the Dulles brothers is a great example because I remember when that
Yeah,
Stephen,
that's the most important example because they're the most religious people to have reached the highest and most influential positions. So people
yeah.
always point to them. Yeah.
Yeah. But then it looks like they're just out there trying to protect United Fruit, and corporations and like having
Right.
land
It's
in other
probably
countries.
both. Yeah.
Well, I think the way that they rationalized it to themselves was that, we need to be powerful economically around the world so that we can uplift the world. And wasn't that their whole discourse about it? I mean,
Yeah.
Guatemala,
Again, so then this is
Guatemala's a
the
better place because of us,
yeah,
right?
this is the construction of the causal hierarchy, right? Like they say
Yeah.
both things. So then which is the more important one, and that depends on your analytical perspective.
Okay. So yeah, okay. I'm with you there. Yeah, no, that's fine. So now that takes us up to me at least. That is basically the narrative until recently, I think. Has you said recently somewhere that ideology hasn't mattered in sort of foreign policy decision making, I think you said, or in geopolitics even. I think
I don't. You'd have to tell me what. That
this
doesn't
was
sound like me.
well, no, this was about you were doing stuff on Fukuyama a while ago and about the
Oh, okay.
the triumph of liberalism.
Yes, 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 yes.
Right. So it's like that. I think that's what you meant. Like ideology no longer. I think this is what you meant. No longer matters because everyone's liberal.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, yes, yes. So,
Yeah.
do you want me? Basically, I said like Fukuyama's argument was that liberalism would be the last ideology. My point is that that's right, but also it doesn't matter because everyone's just capitalist now.
Yeah.
So it's like there have been no ideological challenges to liberalism emerging from China or Russia.
Oh,
In fact, they don't care. They're just capitalists. That is the point. So like Fukuyama's right, there haven't been challenges to liberalism, but it's not what he predicted. It's not because everyone's liberal, it's because everyone's capitalist. That's the move I make in that essay.
I see. So everyone's non-ideological in that sense. They're simply interested in capitalist accumulation.
It doesn't matter anymore. Yes. They're
Well,
simply interested in capitalist accumulation.
yeah.
Yes.
So like the,
And so like the US could make these liberal claims, but if you're again constructing the causal hierarchy there, did they really invade Iraq to bring liberalism there, or did they invade it for other reasons? I would argue more important were the other reasons, despite the fact that you could look at Wolfowitz or some of the mega ideological figures and find them saying ideological things.
yeah.
That's how I would put it.
Yeah, but so like okay. So the Chinese, right, have been doing their Belt and Road Initiative for how many years now, which
I mean,
looks
they've really slowed that down
I
for
know,
quite a while now.
but I'm
Yeah.
just saying that looks like capital accumulation. It doesn't look terribly ideological, right?
Yeah, and they deal with people of all different ideological persuasions. I mean, like just look at who they deal with, right? It's not like the old wars of national liberation under Khrushchev, where
Yeah,
you would only deal with these left-wing regimes. They deal with anyone.
right. That's how I read them. How do you read Putin?
I think Putin wants to maintain a Russian great power presence in Europe, basically.
Okay, so
That's
it's a
primarily it.
is that capitalism? Is he a
Yeah, I
capitalist?
mean, the system is certainly a form of
Okay,
capitalism, of
yeah,
oligarchic capitalism.
gotcha.
Absolutely. And I think I mean, and security concerns are also crucial. This is sorry, I see what you're saying. It's not just economics, it's also security concerns. The United States doesn't have any real security concerns. I don't think China really does either, but for Russia, it certainly does. China has security concerns in the sense that they don't want the US in East Asia anymore.
Yeah,
And they'll eventually be powerful enough to push the US
yeah,
out. But for someone like Putin, who's not really able to globally power project in the way that the Soviet Union was, I think he just wants to maintain Russian great power presence, a Russian great power presence in Eastern Europe and into Asia as well, as far as Russia extends.
right. Because
Uh,
military strength and security is capital, right? So that's part of capital
yeah, they're
accumulation.
intertwined,
But
yeah.
it's not ideological, is the main
I
point
do
here.
not think so. No,
Yeah,
unless I mean, what you could put on Putin is sort of this like broad historical Russian nationalist thing
nationalism.
that he always talks about, right? But to me, that's not the driving force. That's my analytical understanding. He does talk about sort of like Kiev Rus and these old empires, and like this is really Russia's territory. And so the degree to which that is driving things to me, it is absolutely, absolutely in with what Putin says, but I don't think it's the primary cause. I think was worried about Western encroachment and what he views as Russia's
Right,
natural sphere of influence.
right. In Chinese and Russian culture, so as far as I can tell, at the highest levels, and I know Chinese political culture is pretty opaque, but in terms of how they behave, like with the Belt and Road Initiative, they look very unlike Americans, right? They don't make any claims about how other people should live. They don't make claims about, benighted cultures in the dark parts of the third world needing to be uplifted and brought into the light. They're not interested, right? They're not universalists.
Yeah,
And
but Americans say things and then do things like support Saudi Arabia. I mean, so it's like whatever.
well,
And a
yes.
lot of brutal dictators throughout its all history. I think it's mostly like I think people believe it, but it's also not the driving force, right? I think like Samantha Power believes this, but it's not the driving force of her life. I think that Joe Biden might even believe it or whatever, but it's not why he's making decisions, or Colin Powell or whoever, Blinken, all these people.
Well,
They
why?
might believe it, but it's not the causal force in causing them to act in the world.
What is the causal force for them?
I think they believe in American hegemony. I think they
Oh,
believe in a variety of reasons that the United States needs to rule the world.
okay. Now this is a very important, I think, theoretical intervention here. So now there's a difference between, I think you also call this primacy, right? Um,
Yeah, I think that's Stephen Wertheim's term
oh,
initially,
is
but
it?
the American needs to be the prime power.
Oh,
Yeah, I
that's
think
right. It
so.
is. Yeah. Um, right. So there's wow. Okay. So the elites you guys are arguing now, at least, are really motivated by that. They just want America to be number one, hegemonic, powerful, rather
Well, it's
than
like the water they swim in, right? They can't even imagine a world where
yeah.
that's
But
not the
it's
case.
different than Woodrow Wilson, right? It's not like him who again.
Definitely different than Woodrow Wilson.
Okay, this is what I want to
Yeah,
get
yeah.
at. So now I'm saying
Well,
that
it's connected. Okay, just very quickly. Woodrow Wilson, I think, believed that there was this historical destiny of the United States and that it
yeah.
needed to be the leader of the world. Did that necessarily mean global hegemony for Wilson? I think less so than it does for someone like Biden or Blinken today.
No, but I think that don't you agree that Wilson was also a true believer that the United States would actually make the world a better place too? It wasn't just to
Yeah,
be
I mean, I think
powerful.
Blinken believes that too. I think they, I
Oh,
think
you
they
do?
believe
Okay.
that too. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay, yeah, yeah. So
yeah,
it's
yeah.
not
It's definitely connected to like the world will be better under U.S. leadership
yeah,
for sure.
basically a Christian impulse to me.
Even though
That's what the
Blinken's Jewish, I mean, I think
yeah.
it's a yes, I would agree. Yeah, I would agree.
Okay.
There's a millenarian Protestant impulse there for sure.
All right.
Evangelical, even. Yeah.
Well, okay, but again, like when I hear Kamala Harris talk or even Blinken and Sullivan and Biden and these people, like I don't believe it. Like I believe Wilson believed that stuff. I believe LBJ, I know he believed that stuff. he wanted to bring the New Deal to the Mekong Delta. He said that he wanted to bring the Tennessee Valley Authority to the Mekong Delta. I mean, he really believed this. He wanted to make people's lives better. He thought it was through
Yeah,
war, but like I don't know. We don't know. But I'm just
there's a less firm commitment there. I think there's a
yeah.
general, like the way that I view it is if God died in the 19th century, ideology died in the 20th. So there's less of a, which was a replacement for God. So I think there's less of a firm, people don't believe in, I think that people don't believe in things like that. Like in the 20th century, people would really die for liberalism or communism or Nazism. That seems like less on the table today when we're talking about the North Atlantic world, that people don't like really believe in these ideologies to the degree where they would sacrifice their own lives for it.
Hmm.
That's my read of things.
No.
There's no meaning, right? Like it makes sense. God died several hundred years ago. It's taken several hundred years of that to like shake out. And now like the inherent existential meaninglessness of human existence is basically what you believe if you're an educated elite, even if you profess various beliefs, whether religious or non or ideological. Like everyone kind of knows God is dead, right? And particularly among the elite. And it's a centuries long shaking out process.
Wait, hold on now. You went deep there. Hold on. What do you mean? God is dead among whom? I mean, I hang out with some right wingers who definitely don't believe that. So, um, I mean, among the elite, is the elite sort of
Amongst the ruling class,
yeah,
I would
yeah,
say, however we want to define the ruling class,
yeah,
college educated people, and sure,
right.
of course, there's always outliers,
Oh,
right?
and
But the standard belief is like, yeah, God doesn't really exist, and yeah, like all these ideologies are kind of like not replacements for that. And what do we believe in? Careerism, maintaining our power, accumulating stuff, consuming, which is all pretty hollow. And I think that gets into a larger crisis of meaning in the United States. But the problem is there's no solution to it because life is meaningless. It's factually correct. So that's the problem.
you mean materially, objectively meaningless. It has to
Yeah,
be.
there's not some transcendent moments, right? Which is what you believed when you believed in God or when you believed in liberalism or when you believed in communism, right? That transcendent point, origin point, orgasmic moment is not something that people believe in anymore
Um, so
in
I think
general.
so. I think you're right about the left. I don't mean just the transcendent stuff, but just ideological decline. I see that on the left. I mean, this is obvious. And you hang out with my friends on the left. You guys are all friends, and you guys all say the same thing about this, that the left is just sort of fractured, scattered, and and most of it's basically non-ideological, grasping at woke straws or
Yeah, because
whatever.
the U.S. state destroyed the left. I mean, I think I should always like make that
Ah,
clear. It didn't just happen. Like
really?
in the early Cold War, the U.S. state was like, "Fuck the left," and it destroyed it. That's why. It wasn't just because like other options were just so much better and so available. There was a conscious decades long effort to institutionally destroy what was a semi-robust American left.
Don't you think Chevrolet destroyed the American left?
No, I don't think that. I mean, I don't think consumption is a replacement for the meaning that was provided by the political
Oh,
left. I
I
think
do.
that's been obviously failed.
Okay. Um,
I mean, I don't. Maybe in the
oh,
short term, but in the medium term, certainly
okay.
not.
So let's not argue about the cause of the demise of the left. But but we do agree on where the left is, I think, generally right now, which is sort of there's not much of an ideological core. I mean, the handful of actual serious Marxists are like 10 of them, and I know all of them, you know.
I
Um,
don't think there's an ideological core really to liberal. I mean, I think liberalism is intellectually on the ropes. Like I'm writing
yes.
a big essay on
Yep.
Cold War liberalism. Like all these books defending liberalism are just not very good.
Yep.
And
Yep.
I'm surprised
Yep.
to hear you say that about the right, which to me also seems intellectually adrift. Like Patrick Deneen's post liberal. This is not like serious thought. I'm like, what do you mean by the right?
Okay. So first, so intellect, let's see. My point wasn't so much about the intellectual quality, although I agree with you about the intellectual quality of the left and Deneen. No, what I my what I want to say
You
here
mean the
is
right
that
intellectual quality of the right and Deneen?
yeah, no, the left. I think
You think Deneen's on the left?
no. Sorry. Okay, hold on. You and I agree that liberals are dumb, and Patrick Deneen, who's on the right, is also dumb. No, I really do see an intellectual exhaustion on
Yeah,
liberal
I see it across the
among
political spectrum. I
well,
don't.
okay, for sure among liberals, we totally agree on that. That's kind of why we're friends, I think. But I see too on kind of the far left as well, with the rise of wokeness and all of its
Well,
incoherence.
I would not say that's far left. I think that's totally primarily liberal, but okay.
Oh no, I probably agree with you. Okay,
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
fine. Yeah, sure. Now, okay, no, what I want to get to here is um whether or not they're smart. There is clearly, to me, a very powerful and fairly large and global ideological movement that we call in this country Trumpism, and in other countries nationalist populism. But nationalism, which you have, I think, correctly argued, was the beginning of this new world order. I mean, it seems to be returning, and in particular among the working classes, right? I think Trumpism and
Well, I
nationalist
just have to who
is
you
working
thinking
class.
of? What people are you thinking of?
Well,
Like online people? I mean, to me, they're not serious.
no, I mean like Macron, Orban. I mean Trump.
Macron, I would just say, is a
I mean,
classic center leftist neoliberal, but I don't think Orban's that especially powerful.
oh, well, but they're opposed to NATO, and they're opposed to American hegemony, and they're opposed to the post-war liberal order. I mean,
I
they're
mean, Orban is like Orban, didn't Orban just last week allow Sweden's ascension to NATO? He's not important. I think you're overstating
okay.
by far the importance of this, right? I think they're
Oh,
intellectually adrift as well, not especially important.
oh, really? So the
Yeah,
whole nat
personally.
the whole nationalist populist movement that sort
Yeah,
of began
bullshit. Yeah,
with
yeah, dude. It's all fucking
Brexit.
capitalism, man. It's capitalism still running the show. Skynet is self-aware. These people don't matter.
Um, okay. Brexit doesn't matter
Not really. Not in the grand scheme of things.
because the structure of the international economy didn't change. Is that why?
Basically, yeah.
Okay.
Still capitalism,
Fair.
baby.
I mean,
I'm sorry.
trade, a little bit of trade between the
Yeah,
UK
sure,
and
but
Europe.
like
Right.
we're talking about like mega. I mean, like yeah, there was also a trade war against China with Trump. This does not mean that global capitalism is different.
True.
Yeah, I
Okay.
think there's actually there's a lot of much ado about nothing when it comes to like the Orban national populist stuff. I think that's a
Okay.
total not important.
Okay.
I
Okay.
mean, this is what freaks out like the liberal leftists, right? They're all worried about like coming fascism. That assumes that fascism will be able to meaningfully challenge liberal democratic capitalism, which to me is just there's been zero evidence of that.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess to me, it's sort of like a reassertion of that working class nationalist impulse that we saw at the turn of the 20th century, which led to all these very bad things
Yeah,
like
I think
the,
that's totally wrong. I think like no
oh,
offense.
go, yeah,
I just
fine.
think the conditions are so different.
Okay.
It's not meaningfully comparable. I mean, look at Orban. Orban's like a total bourgeois elite, man. He's an Open Society Foundation funded dude who
Oh,
basically found a movement in nationalist politics.
oh,
I just don't think these are serious challenges. I think they're mostly
huh,
organized around the same things as you could criticize the other
huh.
side for, which is criticism, holding on to own power, making a career, becoming part of that international bourgeoisie that Marx
Wow.
predicted.
Wow.
I mean, I thought you were pointing to things like Bronze Age pervert and online people, which to me is just like not unserious fundamentally, you know.
Well, you're wrong about Bronze Age pervert, but that's okay. That's not what I was talking about. So okay, well, if this
Let's
sort
see
of
in 100. I wish I would be alive in 100 years. If the great thoughts of Bronze Age pervert are being taught.
oh, I'm telling you, there's some good stuff in that book, I promise you. But
Yeah, I'm sure.
anyway, um, so okay, if you don't see the rise of nationalist populism as structurally significant, and you might be right about that. That's a great argument you made, and I have to think about this again. But what about the rise of this BRICS thing? What about the rise of what's being called the multipolar world or
I think
multipolar
it's
movement?
nonsense. I
Oh,
think that it's still U.S. hegemony,
wow. Okay.
and in the breach, the global South has been so systematically disempowered over the past 500 years. They're not going to be able to challenge U.S. hegemony. I just don't see that. It's like I wish them. I hope they can. You know,
Okay.
but was the non-aligned movement? Was the new international economic order? Was a new world informational and communications order able to pose structural challenges to the global North? No.
Okay. Um,
I hope they do. I mean, I hope they are able to organize themselves in a way that is able to prove globally meaningful. I have my doubts.
can I so Glenn Deason, I just had him on my show. And he's a realist IR specialist in Norway. And he has a new book out in which he argues that it's actually over. Like the unipolar moment is over
Well, the
because
unipolar moment is over doesn't mean hegemony is over.
oh, what's the difference?
Unipolar moment, the US could basically do whatever it wants with mostly full support and mostly without any geopolitical consequences. Like, for example, be hegemonically dominant in East Asia. I don't think for that is going to be able to continue to be true. It doesn't mean that the US is not the hegemon.
Okay, because I mean, so the argument
That's not
is
multilateral. Like people say China and the US is bipolar. That to me is wild. Obviously, the US is still way more powerful than China.
okay.
But just because the U.S. can't maintain forces at, like, let's say the first island chain right off of China's border does
Mm-hmm.
not mean that the U.S. is not hegemonic. And that's what IR scholars oftentimes do. They
Mm,
equate unipolarity with hegemony, which to me is an analytical misstep.
okay, but I mean, so the biggest evidence for this argument is that the unipolar or hegemony is over. Is that Russia won the war, even though the U.S. sanctioned the living shit out of it and did everything it possibly
Yeah,
could.
exactly. It's a tangential interest. The U.S. could have defeated Russia if it wanted to
No, but oh, I
militarily.
see. I see. Okay.
Absolutely. Not even a question.
True.
Not a
I
question.
see. I see. Okay, because of the basic military hegemony.
Yeah,
Got
it could destroy
it.
it
Okay.
easily.
Word. Okay,
Yeah.
man. I hear that. No, okay.
That I've actually got
Yeah, I
20
know.
minutes, 20 more minutes.
Oh,
So
okay.
my meeting was just pushed 15
Okay,
minutes.
good, 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 good.
So you know. Okay, so we could
Uh,
keep going till 9:45.
oh, wow. I'm rethinking this. All right. But then again, the Russians have the nukes too. So
Yeah,
why
I
is
just think the New York, the U.S. capabilities are more advanced, and the U.S. could have, thrown in more weapons, done various things, et cetera, et cetera.
I see.
I don't think it's worth it. I mean, I don't think Putin would have fought a nuclear war with the United States. I think if Putin was maybe losing for real in Ukraine, and maybe he would have actually considered using a tactical nuclear weapon, that would have been really bad, and it would have forced a lot of decision points, to borrow George W. Bush's memoir title, on the United States. But I think fundamentally the U.S. is hegemonic. The U.S.
Um,
also didn't win the Vietnam War. The U.S. also didn't
right.
really win the Iraq War in a politically
Or
meaningful sense. Does that mean it's not hegemonic? The thing that makes it a hegemon is the U.S. could lose all these wars and it doesn't matter.
I see. Well, it matters to some extent, but you mean not fundamentally,
Not fundamentally.
not structure. The structure of geopolitics doesn't
Yeah,
change. That's
yeah.
it. Because we still have all the bombs, basically, and all the
We still
tanks
have
and
all the bombs. The dollar is the reserve
dollars.
currency.
Right.
We have basically a military that doesn't rely on manpower, which is very, very crucial.
Hmm.
We are developing more and more automated technologies so that the U.S. could just fight wars forever with zero domestic repercussion. So yeah, yeah, I think it's a total misconception of what's going on to say that Russia is winning in Ukraine, therefore the U.S. is an hegemonic. It's disconnected thoughts.
Wow. Okay. So it's not the end of the American century. The American century continues.
The American century is an ideological project. I wrote about this
Yeah.
in I forget somewhere,
Harper's.
but basically the American century has two meanings. One is the sort of structural project of military and economic dominance, and then the ideological project, which is that the world will love America. The ideological project is dead. The military and economic project is not. But the American century, that term does generally refer to the ideological part.
Okay. So you're saying the ideological commitment is done. Yes, but the military and economic piece of it is not.
Yeah, i.e. the important part. The two
Yeah.
important parts. Like Joe Nye developed that concept of soft power kind of to express that ideological dimension of the American empire. And I just think that the American empire is itself less concerned with it. And that was never that causally important,
And
which relates to our pop culture point.
is this because there is no ideological competition anymore, unlike with the Cold War, where there
No, I
was?
just think, again, I just don't think it was ever that. I thought if you look at the American empire as having three sort of legs in the stool,
Uh-huh.
military, economic, and cultural, the cultural was always the one that was less
No,
important.
no, I meant the ideological component. You're saying that's gone, and I'm asking what does that mean? Like, what commitment ideologically is no longer there?
Oh, just the idea that, the way they would put it in the 90s, that like you went around the world and everyone was listening to like Michael Jackson and they had Air Jordans. and so that this was, and not only that, they believed in American consumption and in the American project, and that the United States was leading the world towards this, let's just put it in this way, simply utopian future, even though that was like never quite correct, but whatever. I don't think people believe like the United States is now an agent of good in history in general
Oh,
around the world.
you mean the foreign policy establishment doesn't believe that
The
about
foreign
themselves?
policy establishment, no, but I was just talking about like the average global citizen,
Oh yeah, 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 yeah.
you know,
Okay.
which is I think what people mean when they were when they emphasized the degrading of unipolarity. Along with that was like this America is great idea, which
Mhm.
I think the U.S. has just destroyed over the last 20 years with its many, many, many failed military interventions.
Right. So where does this lead us? Leave us, um, and lead us. I mean, I think you and I actually, I don't know if we're as pessimistic, but we are. I think we're both nervous, scared, because it looks to me like they're clinging on to it, right? The elites in both parties are want to hold on to all those bases around the world. They want to hold on to NATO. They want to have dollar supremacy. They want to have all the components of the American empire maintained and maybe even extended, definitely extended and expanded. Um, and the rest of the world is moving away and against that, more and more, it seems. And do you read it that way too? I mean, it sure seems like in the last 5 years, that's what's been going on.
Yeah, I mean, you could also just look at like the global share of GDP, the share of GDP that the G7 has, and it's just like been steadily declining. So I think there will be transformations in the American imperial presence. I think particularly in East Asia, but again, that doesn't have to do with hegemony. I mean, the U.S. is just so powerful that it is able to not totally direct things, but it's the gorilla in the room of geopolitics. Regardless of what global South countries might desire or say.
Yeah. I mean, just look at the submarines. That's all you got to do. There's charts. Honestly, if you look
Yeah,
at the,
just look at the bases, like
yeah, and the
they're all
bases
over the
too.
place.
Right. China
Those
and
are
Russia
those
have,
those are the structural facts of international relations, and anything that, whether people are annoyed at the United States around the world, as they have good reason to be, I don't think it changes the structural facts.
right. I think Russia has two bases outside of Russia, one in Djibouti.
There's like different numbers. I've heard 20,
Oh,
but not nearly as much as the U.S. That's for
yeah.
sure.
Give them 20. We got 500 to 800, right? Somewhere in that range. And then China has,
750-ish is the
oh, is
current
it?
number. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's pretty impressive. But yeah, the nuclear submarines, man. I mean, each one of those can destroy an
Yeah.
entire continent. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and Americans don't, it's amazing to me. I'm sure you have this feeling too. Do you ever walk around and just think, why are you not all freaking out that we could die in an instant with,
Well, they
trying-
separated it. I mean, I think very effectively, like the U.S. state has basically insulated itself from insulated the public from even thinking about these things in like a very effective way. I personally, that's what I think.
yeah. Is that why Americans are so fucking stupid about international relations? Why they know nothing?
I mean, I think it's just they don't need to know, right? I
Yeah.
don't think that,
Yeah.
like, why would you?
Yeah.
If you're an ordinary person just going through their day, why would, especially when like the states and the media have made it, for ideological reasons, that they believe in the American hegemony we spoke about earlier, have not made this like an active topic of discussion.
Isn't it? It's to me, it is the most lethal and maybe suicidal structure in possibly human history. So
Yeah, I wouldn't have designed it that way.
you have a massive democracy. I mean, in terms of people get to vote for the president, who's the
Yeah,
chief of the whatchamacallit, what's it called again?
chief
Chief
executive.
chief
Oh,
no,
you're talking about the armed forces. Yeah,
military.
the
Jesus Christ.
commander in chief, commander
Commander
in
in
chief.
chief. So they get to select him at least. Okay. There's 350 million of them or whatever, 200 million adults. They know nothing and they don't need to know anything because, as you said, they're so insulated. We are so insulated in various ways. And just is
Except
that
we're just very quickly, we're not like through, we're insulated in overt ways, but like militarized policing, that
right?
stuff does come back home, but it does not read as a foreign policy effect to most people because
Exactly.
it is not presented as such.
Right. And then give that commander in chief, the largest nuclear arsenal in history. So that just seems like a
And also make
recipe.
him 81.
And they make him 81 or make him Donald Trump or any, I mean, or worse. I mean, think about
Right.
wild people who could be president, who the Americans could elect even, and they won't know anything about his foreign policy positions. I mean, that's to me like a recipe for absolute catastrophe. I don't know until the United States of America is decentralized, devolved, and it's like broken up into multiple different statelets with smaller militaries, maybe. I don't know, but this just seems like it's headed for, don't you think?
Hard to know. I mean, I don't think it's a particularly hopeful political moment. Hard to
um,
know, though.
all
Things
right.
change, random things happen.
So, now speaking of cataclysms, you originally, I remember talking to you about this. You originally were at the Jewish Theological Seminary.
Yeah, I
Um,
did my BA there.
and
I did my BA there at dual program between JTS and Columbia.
yeah,
My
so
BAs.
yeah, and I know you've talked quite a bit about Israel and Gaza, but I mean that, like everybody, I was sort of just have been like in a fever over it since October 7th. And I worry that that's sort of messing with my judgment. I think you're a more level-headed person, and I wonder, especially about this issue, like well, first of all, what are your feelings about it? I actually haven't heard that.
I mean, I'm very against the Israeli government's policy in Gaza, which seems to be like being that is increasingly moving towards forced population transfer. And I just don't know what's going to happen because it seems like Egypt is not going to accept a large Palestinian population. I think it's going to be a horrible human rights catastrophe. Not even human rights, it's a human catastrophe in Gaza. I think that's what everyone thinks, right? The debate is to what degree is this a necessary justification? To what degree is this necessary given various Americans' perception of Israeli security? I mean, but pretty much everyone agrees on all sides of this that it's a horrible. At least I've never heard someone really say it's not. That it's a horrible, destructive, terrible thing happening in Gaza.
I've heard some Israelis and friends of Israel in America say they're cool with it,
No,
actually.
that cool with it is that might be said, but no,
Yeah.
it's just then it's
Or
the
no, I mean
justification.
they say things like they'll even say things like, I'm embarrassed by this, but I want to kill them all.
Well, yeah,
I
that's
mean,
pretty bad.
I'm talking about like people you and I know and like, who work at places like
Yeah.
universities, right? Um, so how about this though? Like Israel and the Zionist project generally, how important is that, do you think, in the history of the American empire and or in the present of the American empire?
That's an
Like,
interesting question. I mean,
yeah.
like I think that is ultimately a question about domestic politics. I mean, the Middle East has always been strategically important to various great powers because of its
Hmm.
resources and its central location, and
Hmm.
as a waypoint between Europe and Asia. So that goes back like very long time.
Right.
The degree to which the U.S. relationship with Israel is crucial to the American empire, I think, is ultimately a question about domestic politics. I think it's also ultimately an approach. Sorry, a question that is often misphrased because I think that Jewish lobbying groups were very important in the 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s. But I think in the last 40 or 50 years, it's really Christian evangelical Zionists that
Mm.
have begun to exert a more influential position on the U.S. Israel relationship. So there are basically two large and important political constituencies that effectively want very little daylight between the United States and Israel. Now, the question, though, coming forward is particularly do people under 40 have a different perspective on the U.S. Israel relationship as the Holocaust recedes further and further into history, as the Oslo peace process and the idea of a two-state solution appears increasingly untenable. I mean, I think it's been untenable for a while, but you still hear people talk about it.
Hmm.
Will younger Americans' approach to the U.S. Israel relationship transform, particularly if they consider Israel to be taking actions that they don't support? I imagine it will, which is why it's very strange that the Israeli government, particularly Netanyahu, bet on the Republican Party 10 years ago, because I think like 10 plus years ago at this point, because I do think that the Israeli state has benefited from having pretty cordial relations with both political parties. But if you start to get a constituency, particularly within the Democratic Party, that's very critical of Israel, and if Israel becomes less salient to younger Republicans, you could see a transformation in U.S. foreign policy toward it. But I think partially because we live in a gerontocracy and people who are politicized in a very different moment, people like Joe Biden or even Kamala Harris, the U.S. is just going to continue to support Israel for the time being in the way that it has.
Yeah, time being, but you've seen the numbers about millennials and Gen Zers. They're not having it. I mean, they're
Yeah,
not.
I mean, and that might force a change. I would imagine it would.
I think so.
I would guess it would, but it's not in the immediate offing, that's for sure.
Right, but I guess I do want to look toward that because that could be within 10 years where you have
Yeah.
a majority of Congress even possibly voting to defund Israel. I could see that, or certainly 20
Yeah,
years.
that's certainly possible, which is then this is why the Israeli state's behavior is kind of
Ex
strange.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It's like, guys, do you not realize
Yeah.
if you don't
Well,
have
and that
us,
also has to do with Netanyahu personally is trying to avoid prison, so
I think
that
what's his
shapes
name?
everything as well.
Jennifer, I mean not Jennifer, Jonathan, what's his name? Jonathan Greenblatt, the head of the ADL. He's like the only person, he's like the only Zionist who seems to understand this. He's panicking. He's panicking about young Jews being anti-Zionist now.
Yeah,
And I and he should.
it's not would certainly not help the project that the Greenblatts of the world are trying to promote. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean if they lose young Jews, I don't see them going forward. But so now I don't want to get too much into the weeds of like what's going on right now, but I mean, I do let's talk about it though for a minute. Just um Israel's surrounded, more isolated than ever before. I think this is right. The United States is more isolated than ever before. Yeah, and in terms of Israel as well, especially I would say. Um I mean, you have armies, it seems like, massing around its borders quite literally right now. And God knows how many young men do you think right now in the Middle East are signing up to fight a war with Israel, who want to kill?
I mean, I don't think. I think it would be less generalized to sort of, as I take you're saying, Arabs in the Middle East. Like the degree to which
Yeah,
the fate of Palestine would lead people to die for it. I
yeah,
don't know. I'm skeptical
okay.
that will happen, but you could see something like the U.S. Egypt, sorry, not U.S., the Israel Egypt relationship totally decline, and that you have
Mm,
a state of aggression between the two countries as opposed to a state of peace. That could happen on the governmental level. Whether there will
mm,
be a war between Israel and the nations of the Middle East, I'm much more skeptical about that.
mm-hmm. Okay. Um, do you want to know what the answer is ultimately, though?
What's the answer? Tell me.
Uh, well, I mean, I need to check, but whatever the top rapper is at the moment is the answer. The hip hop artist who is the biggest thing right now is the. I just let me make a real quick pitch and then I'll let you go and maybe you can think about this and tell me why I'm stupid. So over the last 120 or so years, with the rise of the American empire, the global political and economic empire that we talk about all the time, at the very same time, right, since the 1880s, 1890s, you have this rise of American popular culture, which became the most popular culture in world history. And every country has been penetrated by it, or people in those countries have found it of interest to consume it. And to such a degree that damn near every authoritarian regime that we talk about, Nazi Germany, Maoist China, Soviet Union, Castro's Cuba, North Korea, every single one of them immediately upon establishing their regime outlawed American pop culture and were very specific about it. They outlawed jazz, outlawed rock and roll, outlawed dancing, outlawed blue jeans. The clerics across the Middle East, the Islamist clerics across the Middle East, especially in Iran, issue fatwas almost daily against pop stars. Madonna's had a fatwa against her for years. Kim Kardashian's had one, but against things like piercings and tattoos and all the accoutrements of American pop culture, which if you go to Tehran, as I've been told by many people, Tehran is just full of American pop stuff. Like it's just, they love it. And that's true across the Middle East. And I could go on, and I'm sure you know about many, many more examples of this, the evidence of the immense popularity of our lowbrow culture across the world, especially in authoritarian regimes. But the point I make, the argument I make is that that pop culture is what is most subversive of those forms of authoritarianism. And so if we simply stop trying to bomb those countries and intervene and do regime change and let the people stream in TV shows through their satellite dishes, which they do all over the Middle East, better things will happen in the world, both, I think, for them internally, and certainly in terms of foreign relations, because American pop culture has always been very, very popular, but the American military, not so much. American domination, not so much. So that's kind of a, you're not going to like it because it's a free market, essentially, argument. I'm just simply arguing for the government to get out of
I
it.
think culture should be able to flow across borders. I'm fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just have my doubts about that claim for all the reasons we talked about.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
you'd have to prove it to me.
Cool. All right. I got to prove it to you.
Yeah, that's it. That's on you.
Well, like in 10 years, you'll see world peace. So,
Well, there you go.
because of this. All right, man. Thank you so much for this. I know you got a lot going on. But I hope the Kurt Cobain podcast comes out. I hope that's going to be amazing. Is
So do I.
that's still possible, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay, good.
Definitely.
Good. Huge thing.
It
Can't
will
wait for it.
come out. I'll figure it out somehow.
Definitely. No, I learned, this was awesome. I learned a lot from you, and it was like sharpening knives for me. It was like steel on steel there. Really, because
Thanks,
yeah,
man. I enjoyed it as well.
it was interesting that we sort of ended up in the same place at the end, but there was like fascinating dialectic to get there in every case, I thought. So, all right. Thank you, Professor Bessner.
Thanks, Thad.
Okay. This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To become a patron of the show and have access to bonus episodes, AMAs, and the Unreported News Analysis Show, go to patreon.com/unregistered. Thanks for listening.